3 months stood between me and breaking the vow I'd made to my father as he lay dying. When a snowstorm trapped America's most dreaded restaurant, Critic, inside my failing little town. Mine was the only diner still open that night, and the only dish I had to offer him was my dad's humble beef stew, the very recipe that was slowly bankrupting me. I watched Anthony Wright lift the first spoonful to his mouth, bracing myself for the merciless review that would end everything. Instead, he set his spoon down, and tears began rolling down his cheeks. Before we dive in, tell me, what's the one dish that feels like home to you? Leave in the comments. And if stories about inherited recipes, chance encounters, and the memories tucked into every meal speak to you, subscribe so you catch the next one. Now, come with me back to the night that was both the worst and the best of my life. The Blue Ridge Diner hadn't changed in half a century. Red vinyl booths, a chrome counter lined with spinning stools, a corner jukebox that still spun real vinyl, and a menu untouched since 1978. My father, Samuel Parker, had opened his doors at 25 and run the place with the same unbending routine for 50 years, until a heart attack took him 6 months back. The diner became mine, along with the last thing he ever asked of me. Promise me you'll leave the menu alone, Austin. Not a single dish. People need something steady in their lives. So I'd sworn it, and I'd honored that vow even as I watched the place crumble around me. It wasn't the cooking that was the issue. The food was solid, warm, unpretentious comfort fare. The trouble was that solid and unpretentious no longer cut it. 20 miles up the road, farm-to-table spots were plating deconstructed pot roast and gourmet meatloaf. Bloggers couldn't stop gushing over fusion plates and foam garnishes. And there I was, 32 years old, dishing out the identical beef stew my father had been making since before my birth. My girlfriend, ex-now, hadn't minced words when she walked out 3 months earlier. Austin, you're not honoring your father. You're stuck inside his memory. This town is fading, this diner is fading, and you're sinking with it over a promise that stopped making sense a long time ago. Maybe she wasn't wrong. Foot traffic had fallen 60% over half a year. The young families drove to other towns for dinner. Tourists gravitated toward the new cafe down the street with its picture-perfect latte foam. And my regulars, well, they were dying literally. For funerals in 6 months. I was crunching the same depressing numbers for the third time that week when the storm rolled in. It arrived without warning on a Tuesday night in February, the kind of freak whiteout that swallows the world in minutes. By 6, the roads had vanished under snow, the lights were flickering, and my handful of customers had already cleared out, safely home before things turned dangerous. I should have shut the doors early. Should have gone upstairs to my apartment. But stubbornness, or maybe just decades of habit, kept me open until our usual 9 o'clock close. At 8:47, the door swung open on a gust of wind and snow. The man who stepped through was tall, somewhere in his 50s, his fine wool coat coated white. Sharp-featured, silver-haired, carrying an air of authority that felt strange for a place like this. "Thank God," he said, his voice polished, faintly touched by a New York accent. "I've been crawling along for 20 minutes, trying to find any sign of life. Are you still serving?" "Yes, sir," I told him, because that's simply what you say in a town this size, even minutes before closing, even as your whole world is falling apart. "Sit wherever you'd like. Coffee to warm up?" "Please." He slid into the booth by the window, though the glass showed nothing but a wall of white. As he shrugged off his coat, something about his face nagged at me, familiar, though I couldn't place it. I set the coffee and a menu in front of him and watched him scan it with an expression I'd seen countless times, polite letdown at the dated, narrow choices. "What would you suggest?" he asked, and there was an edge to his tone that put me on the defensive. "The beef stews are specialty. It's been on the menu since we opened. Comes with homemade biscuits and a side salad." "I'll take that." He passed the menu back and pulled out his phone, scowling at the blank screen. No bars. Of course. The storm must have knocked out the tower. Happens now and then. Should be back by morning. I ducked into the kitchen, relieved I'd made a fresh pot of stew that afternoon. My father's method was simple. Chuck roast, potatoes, carrots, onion, celery, beef stock, tomato paste, and a mix of herbs he'd never once written down. I'd picked it up by watching, standing at his side through thousands of dinner shifts, soaking the ratios and the little tricks he swore made all the difference. Nothing fancy about it, he'd always say, but it's honest. Every ingredient earns its place, and you don't rush it. Good stew's like good friendship. The flavor needs time to build. Ladling the stew into a bowl, setting out 2 biscuits I'd baked that morning, I felt that same old sting of not being enough. This was comfort food. Da fare. Nothing that would turn heads. The kind of meal that made people feel at home, but wouldn't save my business or prove I was anything beyond a small-town cook running his father's old playbook. I carried the plate to the stranger's table, along with butter and a glass of water. He gave a small nod and picked up his spoon. That's when recognition hit me. I knew exactly who sat across from me. Anthony Wright, the most feared name in American food criticism. The man whose single review had shuttered a 3 Michelin-star restaurant in Manhattan. The columnist whose words in Culinary Quarterly could make or destroy a place overnight. And I just handed him my father's plain, old-fashioned beef stew in a dying diner in the middle of nowhere. My pulse spiked. Part of me wanted to say something, maybe apologize ahead of time for how simple the meal was. But what could I say? Sorry, this won't meet your usual standard, but it's what we've got. That would only make things worse. Instead, I slipped behind the counter, pretending to wipe down the espresso machine while keeping half an eye on him. Wright raised a spoonful, breathed in the steam, and took his first bite. Then he froze completely. The spoon dropped back into the bowl with a clatter. He stared at the food like it had just called out his name. And then, impossibly, tears started sliding down his face. Not a single stray tear, not a subtle glassiness. Real tears, streaming freely down the cheeks of a man famous for his cold, merciless critiques of the finest kitchens on earth. I stood rooted behind the counter, completely at a loss. Had I somehow poisoned the man? Was this some kind of allergic reaction? Should I be calling for help? And if so, how? With no signal and a landline that only reached the volunteer fire station? He pulled a handkerchief from his coat and dabbed at his eyes, but the tears kept coming. Another bite, and his shoulders began to shake. I couldn't just stand there. I crossed his booth. "Sir, are you all right? Is something wrong with the food?" He raised his head, eyes rimmed red. And when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with feeling. "Where did you get this recipe?" Not the question I expected. "It's my father's. He's made it the same way for 50 years. "Why?" "Every ingredient. I need to know every single ingredient, every step, every detail of how it's made." I dropped into the seat across from him, baffled. "It's just beef stew. Chuck roast, vegetables, stock, tomato paste, herbs. We braise it low and slow, about 4 hours. Nothing special." The herbs he pressed. "Which ones exactly?" "Thyme, bay leaf, and—" I hesitated here because this was the part my dad had always kept quiet about. Something else. He called it his secret touch, but never told me what it was. I worked it out eventually just from the smell. "Marjoram. Barely a pinch, stirred in during the last half hour." Wright dropped his head into his hands. "Marjoram. Of course. I should have known. I should have remembered." "Mr. Wright," I said, since there was no use pretending I didn't recognize him, "I don't understand what's going on. Did I do something wrong?" He lifted his eyes, and what I saw there was a strange blend of grief, wonder, and something close to happiness. "You know who I am? Everyone in this business knows who you are, sir. Then you should also know I've eaten at every restaurant that matters across North America, probably half of Europe too. I've been served by legendary chefs, dishes priced higher than most people's weekly wage. I've tasted brilliance, invention, mastery at the highest level." He gestured toward the bowl in front of him. "And this plain bowl of stew in a roadside diner, is the most important meal I've had in 20 years. Because it tastes exactly, impossibly, like my mother's recipe, one I thought had died with her." The kitchen suddenly felt stifling. I tugged at my collar. "That's not possible. My father invented this recipe." "Did he?" Wright asked softly. "Or did someone hand it down to him?" I leaned back, thoughts spinning. My father had opened the diner in 1978 at 25. He always claimed he'd learned to cook from the finest teacher he'd ever had, but never said more than that. I'd always assumed he meant his own mother, my grandmother, though she swore up and down she'd never taught him a thing beyond boiling water. My mother's name was Catherine Wright, Anthony went on. Before she married my father and left for New York, she lived not far from here. Worked in restaurants, saved what she could, dreamed of running her own kitchen one day. She had a talent for cooking, not elegant food, but the kind that made you feel cared for. Her beef stew was something people still talked about. He took another spoonful, eyes closing. She died 20 years ago. An aneurysm, out of nowhere. Gone before any of us could say goodbye. And her recipes went with her. She never wrote a word down, said cooking was feeling, not measuring. I spent years trying to rebuild her stew and never managed it. Something was always missing, some piece I couldn't name. The marjoram, I said quietly. The marjoram, he confirmed. She called it her secret whisper, just enough to add depth without giving itself away. Idifurwuten. I must have tasted it 1,000 times and never known what it was. But how could your father have known her recipe? Wright reached for his wallet and drew out a worn, faded photograph, sliding it across to me. I've carried this since she passed. It's the happiest I ever saw her, in a kitchen back when she was young. The photo showed a woman in her mid-20s, standing in a kitchen I recognized instantly. The Blue Ridge's own, newer looking but unmistakably the same room. She was laughing, apron on, wooden spoon in hand. Beside her, arms slung over her shoulders, stood a young man I also knew, my father, decades before I was born. I flipped the photo over. Faded ink on the back read, Catherine and Sam, 1979. Best kitchen partner I ever had. Promise I'll never change your stew. God, the floor seemed to shift beneath me. That's my father. They worked together. She must have, Wright said, wonder softening his voice. Before New York, before my father, she must have worked here. Taught yours her recipes. Made him promise to keep them alive. I thought back to my father's final words, his insistence that I never touch the menu. I'd assumed it was about tradition, about pure stubbornness. It wasn't that at all. It was a promise to a friend, a vow to protect something priceless that had been placed in his hands. Mr. Wright, I said, my own throat tightening now. My father made me promise the exact same thing. On his deathbed. Made me swear I wouldn't change a thing on this menu. I thought I was doing it for him. Turns out I was doing it for your mother, too. We sat there without speaking for a while. Two strangers bound. Together by one woman's cooking, by a recipe that had outlived decades and crossed generations. Could I see the kitchen? Wright asked eventually. I like to understand how this miracle survived. I led him through the swinging doors into the Blue Ridge's small, well-worn kitchen. Everything old, everything cared for. The 6-burner stove Dad had bought secondhand in '82. The ancient fridge still humming along. The wooden cutting boards worn to a shine from decades of use. Wright moved through it like he was walking through a church. He trailed his fingers over the counters, studied the hanging pots, read the labels on the spice jars. This is exactly the sort of kitchen she loved, he said. Simple, honest, built for work, not for show. She used to say fancy equipment was just a way to hide a lack of skill. Mr. Wright, can I ask you something? Anthony, please. I think we're past titles. Anthony, then, why did you become a critic at all? If you loved your mother's cooking that much, why spend your career tearing other people's food apart? He went quiet, still surveying the room. Honestly, I was searching for her. In every meal, every dish I reviewed, some part of me was hunting for that feeling of home, that sense of being loved that her food always gave me. And I never found it. Not once in 20 years. So I turned bitter. I took it out on chefs who were only trying to make people happy, the same thing my mother had done. That's why your reviews cut so deep, I said, understanding dawning. You weren't judging the food. You were grieving. Perhaps, though that hardly excuses the damage I've done to good people's careers. He turned toward me. Austin, may I ask you something now? Go ahead. What's your plan for this place? Your father's been gone half a year. You must have thought about what comes next. The question I'd been dodging for months. I don't know. I promised him nothing would change, but the diner's dying. We lose money every month. 3, maybe 4 months out, I'll have to shut it down for good. Because you're serving your father's food, his way, to a world that's moved past it, Anthony said. But what if the world hasn't actually moved past it? What if it just forgot what mattered in the first place? I don't follow. He swept a hand across the room. This place, this food, these recipes, they're not relics. They're real. In a world obsessed with foam and tweezers and ingredients nobody can pronounce, you're offering something that's grown rare, honest comfort, made with real skill, kept alive out of love. That's not nothing. That's everything. Then why isn't anyone coming? I asked, months of frustration spilling out. Why am I serving 20 meals a day when I used to do 100? Because nobody knows what you've got, Anthony said simply. You're the best-kept secret in the county, and secrets don't pay the bills. You need people to hear your story, and I think I know exactly how to make that happen. The storm raged on through the night. Anthony phoned his assistant on our landline to explain the delay, then helped himself to seconds of stew while we kept talking. He told me about his mother, not Catherine the cook, but Catherine the woman. How she used to sing while chopping vegetables. How she believed feeding someone was a form of love. How she died with dreams unfinished, never having opened her own restaurant, yet having touched more lives than she ever knew through her cooking. I told him about my father, his stubborn sense of integrity, his pride in doing things properly, his belief that consistency itself was a kind of virtue. How he worked every day of the week for 50 years, fed generation after generation of this town, and died in his own kitchen doing exactly what he loved. They sound like they understood each other, Anthony said. Your father and my mother. Both of them believers in what simple, honest food could do for a community. He kept a recipe alive for 45 years, and I've been keeping alive for him ever since. I just don't know if that's enough anymore. Then, let's make sure it is, Anthony said. 3 days later, once the roads had cleared and Anthony was back in New York, he called. I've written something, he told me. Not my usual kind of piece. Not a review at all, really. It's about food and memory and the ties that outlast us. I'm sending it your way before it runs. Tell me if anything makes you uncomfortable, and I'll change it. The email landed minutes later. I opened the file and started reading. The Stew That Stopped Time, a personal essay by Anthony Wright. It wasn't criticism, no rating, no technical breakdown. It was a love letter to his mother, to my father, to the Blue Ridge Diner, and to the strange power food has to carry memory across decades. He described the storm, stumbling onto the diner, that first spoonful pulling him straight back to childhood. He wrote about discovering the impossible, that his mother's recipe had survived, guarded by a man who vowed never to alter it, and carried forward by a son honoring his own father's wish. He wrote about authenticity in an age obsessed with artifice, about the gap between food built to impress and food built to comfort, about how the single most important ingredient in any dish can't be bought or measured. It's the care poured into making it. And he wrote about the Blue Ridge Diner itself as a place worth saving, a place where anyone could find what he had found, a taste of home, a thread back to the past, proof that some things deserve to stay exactly as they are. I called him the moment I finished. Anthony, I can't let you run this. It's too personal, and the exposure is exactly what you need, he said, finishing my sentence. Austin, this is the most honest piece I've written in my whole career. 20 years I spent tearing down other people's work while chasing something I didn't even know I was allowed to find. You and your father handed me back a piece of my mother. Let me hand you something in return. What if people show up disappointed? What if the food doesn't measure up? The food is perfect, Anthony said flatly. It's been perfect for 45 years. Trust me. Trust your father. Trust Catherine. They knew exactly what they were doing. The essay ran in Culinary Quarterly 3 days later and spread like wildfire within hours. By the end of that first day, the diner's landline, since I had no website, no real online presence to speak of, was ringing nonstop with people asking about hours, about the menu, about how to find us. By the end of the week, we were booked solid 3 months out. By the end of the month, I'd rehired the 2 servers I'd let go and brought on a part-time cook just to keep pace. People drove in from across New England to taste the stew that had brought Anthony right to tears. They photographed the booths, the menu, their own plates. They wrote their own posts about stumbling onto this hidden gem. But more than the food itself, they came for what Anthony had put into words: authenticity, connection, the feeling of stepping into a place that valued tradition and craft over trends and profit. The Blue Ridge Diner was saved. And somewhere in all of it, I finally understood why my father had bound me to that promise. It was never about the food being flawless, though it was. It was never about clinging blindly to the past, even if it looked that way. It was about recognizing that some things hold their value precisely because they don't change, because they stay fixed points in a world that won't sit still. My father had kept Catherine Wright's recipe alive not out of nostalgia, but because he understood exactly what it was worth. And by asking the same of me, he made sure both her legacy and his would keep going. 6 months after the essay ran, Anthony came back to town. No blizzard this time. He drove up from New York on purpose on a clear September afternoon. He wanted to see it, he said, taking in the diner, now bustling with life. Wanted to see what had come of it all. Every booth was full, every stool at the counter taken, and in the corner hung something new. A framed photograph of a young woman in a kitchen, smiling, wooden spoon in hand, a young man's arm around her shoulders, smiling too. Anthony stood before it a long while, saying nothing. When he finally turned back to me, his eyes were wet again. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping her alive, for honoring what my mother and your father built together." "Thank you," I answered, "for helping me see why it mattered, for showing me that keeping a promise isn't the same thing as staying stuck in the past." We had dinner together that night, after closing. Beef stew, naturally, and biscuits, and conversation that ran until midnight. We talked about our parents, about what they'd left behind for us, about the strange, enduring ways love and memory carry forward. "I've decided something," Anthony told me as he got ready to leave. "I'm stepping away from restaurant criticism. That essay about this place, that's my last one. I'm done tearing into other people's passion. I want to build something different." "What will you do instead?" "I'm writing a cookbook about my mother, about the way she approached food, about how cooking ties us to the people we love. And I'd like your help. Your father kept her recipes alive. Maybe the two of us can finally share them with everyone." 6 months later, Catherine's Kitchen, Recipes for Connection hit shelves. It featured Catherine Wright's dishes, cooked and photographed right in the Blue Ridge's kitchen, alongside stories from both of us about the parents who shaped who we became. The book climbed the bestseller lists, but what mattered more was what it taught people. The same thing my father had always known. The best food doesn't need to be complicated or cutting edge. It just needs care behind it, love in the serving, and people worth sharing it with. The Blue Ridge Diner thrives now. Same menu we've always had, made exactly the way it's always been made. People travel from all over to taste Catherine Wright's recipe, kept alive by my father and carried on by me. And every time I ladle out a bowl of stew, every time I stir in that secret whisper of marjoram in the final half hour, I think about the promise my father made to Catherine 45 years ago and the one I made to him. Some promises are worth keeping, especially the ones that seem to be holding you back, because they were never really about the past. They're about what we carry forward, about honoring the people who made us, about protecting the connections that make us human. My father's unglamorous beef stew saved my diner, but it did more than that. It connected me to people I'd never have met, taught me things I didn't know I needed to learn, and showed me that the one ingredient no recipe can list is the love that outlives us, kept alive in every instruction followed faithfully, every secret held close, every promise honored. What did you make of how Anthony worked through his grief by chasing down his mother's recipe, and how he turned that pain into something worth preserving? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If this story about family recipes, unlikely connections, and the strength of a kept promise moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like it. And don't forget the notification bell so you never miss the next one.